Let's bring in Dr. Rahul Pandit does join us. Now we finally have him. So, Dr. Pandit, what happens? What happens if you do overuse or wrongly use antibiotics? Does that also have side effects? What does this mean for you? What does this mean for all of us, as a community?
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much for having me on the show. So, it's not just that we are over prescribing antibiotics. When we are actually consuming them, we are consuming them in inadequate doses and inadequate duration, and probably the wrong antibiotic for the bug. That's the first problem. I agree with Dr. Sareen and Dr. Kang that for viruses, we really don't need to have any antibiotics to be prescribed. The problem is somebody like me who works purely in intensive care unit. Right now, when I get a patient who is critically ill and is referred to me from a secondary or a primary center, majority of the time, the highest antibiotic has already been given to him or her few days ago. And that really leaves us with very few options to actually use. And when we do get culture and sensitivity positive on these patients, many a times, majority of the antibiotics are resistant. And then we have to really work hard to go back to some of the antibiotics which we were using, say, 2 or 3 decades ago. Something like colistin, which has been the polymyxin group of antibiotic, which was used several decades ago, is now something we have started using quite regularly for the last 8 to 10 years in our ICU. And people are moving and looking at various other antibiotics which could be useful for these multi-drug resistant organisms, because by the time they reach ICU, they are already into organ dysfunction, sometimes unfortunately multi-organ dysfunction. So we don't have a lot of time, and there is no luxury available with us to get a quick understanding of what the resistant pattern is going to be. So we need to have good tools to understand what the resistant pattern is. Something is coming up in terms of the PCR based techniques which we are now having it, but it's very expensive and probably out of reach for many of our countrymen. The second problem is that when these patients do come and we do use a combination of antibiotics, they have their own problems. Sometimes with the combination, we actually give them some bacteria or some problems like Clostridium difficile, for example, which may worsen the gut and the flora of the gut, which Dr. Sareen was so nicely alluding to, and make us more sicker than what we were. So everything actually is a jigsaw, and the jigsaw needs to be solved at the bottom level, which is stop the prescription of antibiotics, so that when we move across in the forward direction, we will be right.
You're basically complicating matters, making things. So if I can just sum up, please correct me, just cut in if I'm wrong. So you're saying this would lead to more serious illnesses, longer recoveries, more frequent, longer hospital stays, clearly in ICU, and more expensive treatment also.
And perhaps mortalities as well as complications of the multiple antibiotics which we will be using. Now I work also in Australia for 2 weeks in a year. If I have to prescribe anything more than a first generation antibiotic, even as an ICU specialist, I have to take the permission of ID specialist. That's the kind of prescription policies we need to bring in, so that checks are put in on people who can be prescribing and who could not be prescribing.